Welcome back to the shop, my friends. Steve here at SKS Props, and this is part 2 in my EVA foam dragon build. If you haven't checked out part 1 yet, feel free to do that, because in that video I went over all the steps that it takes to put the base structure for this head together, including some free PDF files that you can download directly from my website in case you would like to make your own. I also went over how to make some really cool dragon eyes and some super simple horns. In this part 2 video, we're going to be adding a ton of details, including some teeth, some scales, and a wicked looking dragon's tongue. Now, the entire head is of course made all out of my HD foam and foam clay, both of which you can find over at Blick Art Materials. We've got a lot to do to put this head together, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to be using my line of foam clay to make the dragon's teeth. The clay is rolled in my palm and formed by hand before being stuck down to some poster board. The teeth are then left to dry for 24 hours, and as you can see, I made a bunch of different shapes and sizes. The shape of the teeth can now be refined using a sanding sponge. And I go ahead and cut the bottom of the teeth flush to allow that part of the material to dry as well. The teeth can now be glued to the lower jaw. I'm going to start in the middle and work my way out. At this point, I actually pulled up some reference images of crocodiles. This allowed me to get some real-world references for the teeth's shape and placement. The placement of the teeth can then be repeated for the upper jaw. I try to be mindful of how the teeth would line up if the jaws could close. Even though the mouth of my dragon will remain open, I allowed the teeth to dry for another day, and now it's time to add the gums. I start by wetting the surface of the foam with some water. I could then roll out some foam clay into long strands. The clay was then pressed up against the teeth as I worked my way around the lower jaw. Once the clay had been pressed into place, I could then use a wet tongue depressor to push the clay in between the teeth. The clay can also be drawn down and smoothed out by using some additional water. The same process of attaching the gum to the mouth was then repeated on the inside of the jaw. To move the clay and define it a little more, I then switched over to a silicone tip tool. I want to soften the transitions on the inside of the mouth, so more foam clay can be rolled into strands and then pressed along the bottom seam. If your foam clay needs more working time or you need to make it more malleable, just add some more water. I also use some foam clay in the bottom jaw just to simulate some organic shapes. All the steps for this process are then replicated to make the gums for the upper jaw. While the gums are allowed to dry, I'm going to start working on the eyes. So I'm going to take part A and trace and cut that out of some 6mm foam. This is going to act as a spacer inside of the eye socket so that the eyeball sits flush. Once part A was in place, I then sanded away some of the top section as seen here. By removing some of the foam, this allows the eyeball to move forward into the socket. I cut some small rectangular sections out of 4mm foam. These are adhered to the top of the bulbs and will act as an anchor point on the inside of the skull. To secure the bottom of the eyeball to the inside of the skull, some larger strips of 4mm foam were glued into place. Now at this point I've got some small gaps on either side of the eyeball, and to cover these up I'm going to start by using part B, which is going to be traced and cut out of some 6mm foam. This piece is going to be glued on the inside of the skull to the front of the eyeball. Part C is also traced and cut out of some 6mm foam, but this piece covers the gap at the back of the eyeball. With these foam pieces in place, I can now add some water and foam clay to make these sections look more organic. I really wanted to make it look as though the eye is surrounded by flesh. Various silicone tip tools are used to sculpt the clay, and then I'll use a watered down paintbrush to help smooth out the surface. With all this sculpting complete, I will now allow the foam clay to dry and skin over so I don't distort the surface. After 24 hours, the foam clay is dried enough that I can now continue the assembly process. Using some parchment paper and more foam clay, I'm now going to start making the scales for the dragon's head. The foam clay is pressed flat, and then I use some scissors to cut some scale shapes. By using scissors, it puts a slight bevel around the entire scale. Now a thing to note here is I'm not really planning the placement, I'm just kind of going with what works and I think looks good. So don't feel that you have to copy what I'm doing. In fact, if you didn't even want scales on yours at all, that's fine too. The same basic process is repeated as I move around the dragon's head. I'll wet the foam with some water, add the foam clay scale, and then add some more water on top to help smooth it out. When I got to the side of the head, I wanted to mimic the same basic design, where larger scales in the back, and as I move towards the front of the face, the scales get smaller. And if I ever needed to reshape anything, I could always use some silicone tools. Also, while you're adding the scales, make sure to leave some space around the horns. That way we can add transitions from the skull to the horns as well. For the transitions from the horn to the skull, I start by wetting the surface with a paintbrush. Then just like the gums, I'm going to roll out foam clay into some long strands. These can then be pressed against the horns, then I could use tools to pull the foam clay down into the skull. Anytime I got too close to the scales, I could then switch over to some silicone tip tools to sculpt around them. The same process is then applied to the other horn. This again shows when I'm done sculpting, I'll use a watered down paintbrush to help smooth out the surface. Once again, all the clay is allowed to skin over before moving on. Now it's time to attach the upper and lower jaws together, but the way I build it, on the lower jaw this back section needs to come in some. I could then reglue the side piece, and now the lower jaw fits perfectly inside the back of the head. Bob Smith superglue is added to the sides, and then these pieces can be attached to the inside of the back of the head. This allows me to open the jaws to see how far I'd like them to go. Then using some more super glue, I attach the cheekbone section to the lower jaw. Now this of course is going to leave a gap on the inside of the mouth, and that's where part D is going to fill this space. Now depending on how far you have your dragon's mouth open up, you may need to change the shape and size of this for your build. After the piece has been cut out, I can then take my rotary tool and round over the front and add some organic details to the sides. More super glue is used and part D can be glued into place. Now just like the other sections that had seams, I'm going to use more foam clay to help smooth out this transition. The additional foam clay is added to the bottom and to the top on the inside of the skull. And while I'm at it, I'm going to use some more foam clay to clean up the seams and add additional textures on the top. This step is really about personal preference and how much of the mouth will be visible once the head is mounted on the wall. At this point I realized I should have added a septum inside of the dragon's nose. So if you haven't built yours yet, this is something you could easily do earlier in the building process. And it's good enough because foam clay is going to be added to give it an additional texture. The mouth is dry, the nose is dry, the top scales are dry, so now I can work on the scales on the sides of the lower jaw. This process is exactly the same as the top, not really having a concrete plan of where the scales go, but just seeing what looks good. Now of course I've got to have a tongue for my dragon, so part E is going to be traced and cut out of some 10mm foam. Part F is also going to be traced and cut out of some 10mm foam, and when these two pieces are glued together, it's going to allow this tongue to keep its shape. I manipulate the piece that will be the top of the tongue, and then I add some super glue to part F. Once these pieces have been glued together, I can then use my rotary tool to round over all the edges and make it look more like a dragon's tongue. And as you can see here, this tongue is going to keep its shape and it looks pretty cool. I check the placement, and once I'm happy with where it is, I can glue the tongue to the inside of the mouth. Part G is also going to be traced and cut out of some 10mm foam. This small section is going to be glued under the tongue and to the bottom of the mouth. Once the tongue was in place, I cut 2 more sections of part D. I just wanted to make sure I had enough room before I went to the trouble of attaching these to the inside of the mouth. But I've got plenty of room, so I'm going to glue these to the inside of the mouth to act as an additional detail. More foam clay is added to transition these sections as well. Now the tongue that I made ended up being a little too short for my liking, so I had to cut and attach an additional spacer, but I've already taken this into account, so the tongue that's on the template is correct. Foam clay is once again going to be used, and it's going to help cover up this seam section as well. so you all can see the steps that I took to put together my own custom EVA foam dragon head. And again, if you'd like to make your own, free PDF files can be found over on my website that you can download to build right along with the videos. Now, my dragon head is going to be a wall-mounted display, so I've got to figure out how to functionally mount it to the wall, plus in a way that makes it look great, and that is going to be in the next video. So if you are building any of my builds or utilizing HD foam, be sure to tag me at SKSProps on Twitter and Instagram because I want to see your creations. Until next time, build your best with the best. HD Foam.